what is the purpose of food at a really fundamental level? It's about nutrition, it's about freshness, it's about taste. And these are three things that have not been optimized for the last 30 or 40 years. So when we said, can we buy this? They were like, we've been educated as farmers for the last 30 or 40 years that this is a waste product. This belongs in the bin. This should go to the cows.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava and you are listening to episode 202 of the Startup Playbook podcast, a weekly series where I sit down with successful tech founders, investors and operators to unpack their journey, lessons and insights to help current and future entrepreneurs. The voice that you heard a little bit earlier was that of our guest for this episode, Josh Ball, the co-founder of Farmer's Pick. Farmer's Pick helps eliminate food waste by saving what would otherwise be wonky food that would go to waste by supermarkets and farmers. Since launching in 2020, they've gone on to save over 7 million kilograms of food waste, now have a team of over 120 people, and last year generated $16 million in revenue. In this interview, we covered a wide range of topics, including the importance of having a strong mission and values to help guide strategic business decisions, balancing frugality with 100% year-on-year growth, why they decided to go down the equity crowdfunding path rather than raising from traditional VC funds, scaling storytelling to both their staff and to their customers, and much more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Josh Ball. Hi Josh, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast and thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me on, Rohit. Really excited to be here.
Likewise, you've got such a great story, which I'm very keen to dig into. But Josh, for those people that may not be as familiar with you and your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, so I'm Josh Ball, the founder of Farmer's Pick, and effectively what we do is we offer a fruit and vegetable delivery service across the east coast of Australia. And I guess what sets us apart is that we work directly with farmers to buy the produce that has been sort of systematically rejected by the supermarkets and the big chains, primarily because of aesthetic reasons. So if something looks a little bit bendy or it's blemished or it's too small, it'll get rejected out on the farm, creating massive food waste, like 2.4 billion kilos left out on the farm in Australia every year. And what we're doing is we're working with farmers to try and address that and along the way creating win-wins for farmers, but also for consumers. So with saving sort of up to 30-40%.
Yeah. Amazing. And, obviously incredible business and I'm keen to, as I mentioned, dig into, but maybe as a starting point, would love to go back to your career prior to starting Farmer's Pick. From what I understand, you worked at a couple of startups, so Promise Pay or Assembly Payments as it's known now.
Yeah, spot on. So that was out of uni, or in the last year of uni, I was like, I want to work in a startup. I don't know, it seemed like the cool thing, having studied economics and finance. I really wanted to just get in there, learn and understand the industry. It's so hard to see, I think, until you really get in there that what's actually going on, what does it mean? And then moved to Xero and was there for sort of 3 or 4 years whilst I also set up Farmer's Pick. So yeah, strange background, I guess tech, SaaS businesses, and that was the sort of the genesis. But then coming into Farmer's Pick, I think that really set up to think, tech first, like how do we create a tech-enabled services business as opposed to, going down a traditional brick and mortars or, fruit and veg shop, which were sort of the other options, I guess, in the market.
Yeah. And I guess, to your point, startups are a lot more appealing now than they were a few years ago. And, especially if you're a student, you're sort of looking to really dig your teeth into something, startups can be very enticing and appealing, but there's often this whole, do I jump straight into it? Do I go and work for someone else and kind of learn the ropes? I know for me, I wanted to kind of jump straight in after a couple of months, and trying to tell your Indian parents that you're leaving an engineering job to start a fashion tech company is a very fun conversation to have. But we negotiated that I'd kind of stay around for 2 years and they wouldn't say anything and let me do what I wanted to do from then on. But what was that experience like for you in terms of working at Promise Pay and I guess the learnings that you got from that you're then able to apply to Farmer's Pick now? Yeah,
I think the superpower of startups is agility and finding product fit. Early days, I think that's really, that's the first thing you got to do in a startup, right? Is like, hey, does someone want to buy this? Or else you're going to pretty quickly fail, I think. And I think, as I sort of was at Promise Pay, some really great exposure across just every part of the business. I think when you're really early and you don't really know what to expect exactly, it's kind of vague, being able to just talk to everyone within the business. Everyone's in the same room pretty much. There's maybe 20 people. They've all done stuff for 10, 20 years or whoever. And just being able to get that exposure, I think, early days and quickly really helps just understand and kind of create an understanding. And I guess where I sort of got to after that was like, I want to actually go to more of a scale up. And this was, yeah, this was sort of zero, I think now 7-8 years ago I started there. So it was sort of going from the challenger. It started to really challenge and just seeing, I guess, a startup then working at scale. It had a relatively clear product market fit, started to know its customer, and started to really find its strengths in the cloud accounting space. And then I guess seeing that just going from scrappy, how do we find a few customers who are interested in our stuff, to okay, how do we actually market to hundreds of thousands of, like in this case, small businesses and accountants and bookkeepers. So just seeing the kind of evolution and the jump was a really interesting thing to kind of watch. And I think then coming into where we're at with Farmers Pick is that transition in our own way. Like we've been from scrappy startup who wants to buy this thing through to how do we actually get all Australians involved in our mission and our vision to fight food waste, and to do it on a daily and a weekly basis.
What was the most surprising lesson that you kind of learned from your time at Promise Pay or Xero, or just something in particular that you were very mindful of bringing over to Farmers Pick?
I think for me that something I also saw at one point with Farmers Pick was the double-edged sword of tech. Like it can swing really hard in your favor, but if you get it wrong, it can go wrong really quickly as well. Like we sort of built fundamentally our own bespoke platform to be able to service our customers as we evolved, and there was some sort of hiccups along the way. And there's some of those things that are really hard to undo. Like once they go wrong, you're like, oh boy, all hands on deck to fix that. So I think just seeing that the leverage in technology just goes both ways.
Yeah, and from what I understand, through sort of COVID, you were very sort of proactively looking for opportunities, and I think almost the genesis of different businesses is always really interesting to hear. People that we have on the show, some people just kind of stumble on an opportunity and sort of don't even realize that it's a thing. From what I understand, in your case, it was you were sort of more proactively looking for the right thing and within a particular thing. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the original concept and the idea came about?
I think the genesis of it was wanting to just do something, I think, a bit more tangible. After sort of years in tech, I think you can get very easily disillusioned and disconnected from who the customer is and through what you actually do. Like the outcome of what you do may have a huge impact on a business. Like the amount of businesses, for example, with Xero that I've spoke to throughout my time there, who are like, this changed my life. This gives me clarity on what I do. I know I can pay myself. These huge things, but to sort of get that contact can be difficult at times. So I think for me, I was like, how can I do more? I guess always cared about the environment, nature, and the impact that we have, or humanity's having on the planet, and sort of with climate change and all of that. So I was looking at what are the biggest things that we can do as a society to reverse climate change, and food waste, like in particular, came to the top of the list as the most readily addressable thing that we can do. And from there, I guess that sort of started this itch and this like bit of an adventure. Everyone had spare time in COVID and was maybe looking for something a bit novel. And I think coming across food waste as one of those massive reasons was a really interesting one. So digging into that, and also getting inspiration from some other businesses around the world that were doing something similar. So there was Misfits Markets in the US, which is now a behemoth, and really changing the food system over there, addressing food deserts. And then there's a few over in Europe as well. So I think combining all of those things together, and then it was about how do we get validation on that. So I spoke to my co-founder, Josh Brooks Duncan, and his background is more on the supply chain and logistics side. He worked in sort of large scale logistics operations, and we're like, hey, let's go check it out. And we were just talking about the problem, and we went down to one of the local markets and we saw like bendy carrots, and we're like, I've never really looked for them, but here they are down at this farmer's market. And we quickly were like, okay, cool. How do we validate that these huge numbers of food waste are real? So we literally drove down to Werribee out of Melbourne, and went to try and like find a farmer, which was pretty funny. We were walking through the gates. There's mud, it's mud, it's grubby. And we're just like, hey, like who's running this place? And we're just having a chat to them. And we're like, hey, like, we hear all these stats about this crazy food waste. Like, is it true? And like, how does it affect you? And they're like, yeah, come over this way. Have a look at these cauliflowers. See how it's a little bit yellow, like barely visible. And He's like, we got literally thousands of these every day. So that was the validation I think we needed. And we're like, cool, let's buy it and put it in a box and see if anyone will buy it. And that was literally the start of it. Yeah, from the first boxes.
Yeah, I think it's really curious in terms of starting from that really big problem of like, how do we solve food waste, because it's such a big issue. But again, one of the challenges of having something that is so broad is going like, what is the right way of trying to address that? And oftentimes, there is this kind of like discovery period of going through those sort of things. And I love the fact that you actually went out and spoke to real people affected by this and real potential customers or suppliers in this case. When you went and had those initial conversations with them, did you have the initial concept in mind in terms of the model, or as you said, like the intention of kind of buying that? Was that the intention, or were you sort of coming at it more from an open-ended, like we just want to sort of understand what's going on here?
Yeah, I think we came at it from, you have the problem, you have this problem. How can we use our knowledge in supply chain, in sort of tech and go to market, and like, is there a different way that we can address this? Or I think really like flip the script on the story of food waste being like, oh, it's this big burden. There's all this stuff that's wasted and it gets rejected. And it's like, there's a lot of like the negative connotations around waste and landfill and all these like really like strong negative words. And we're like, well, actually it's just surplus and it's just imperfect. It's not actually that wrong. And when we think about what is the purpose of food at a really fundamental level, it's about nutrition, it's about freshness, it's about taste. And these are three things that have not been optimized for the last 30 or 40 years. So when we said, can we buy this? They were like, we've been educated as farmers for the last 30 or 40 years that this is a waste product. This belongs in the bin. This should go to the cows. So I think there was also a little bit of confusion from the farm being like, wait, you want to pay me for this? Which is it was actually a really good moment because we were like, yeah, we actually do. And they're like, all right, let's go.
Yeah, I imagine that sort of education piece for farmers, as you said, have been so used to that for such a long time, would have been challenging. I imagine the other side of that is trying to convince customers of that as well, because they may not necessarily be used to produce that sort of looks like that, or especially things that are branded as waste to consume that. What did that process look like in terms of validating that side of the market?
Yeah, so I think trying to find some people really early as we sort of navigated how to tell this story. And this is something we didn't know how to do at the start. We just thought, this makes no sense. You've got food insecurity, you've got food waste, you've got crazy supermarket prices. Why are these things all happening concurrently? So I think as we went through, we just through repetition and constant communication with customers around like, hey, why do you buy a farmer's pig? And just having that contact with the customer, and they're like, oh, well, it saves me money and it's not actually as bad as it sounds like it might be. So I think over time, like really showing potential customers what imperfect meant, being that, oh, it's just this tiny little blemish on it. It's like, oh, well, that actually, it's on an orange, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to take that off anyway. So there's some of these like just crazy illogical reasons that things get rejected. And I think just really highlighting that it's not about nutrition, it's not about freshness, it's not about taste. It's purely about aesthetics. That seemed to have really, really resonated. Yeah.
And again, one of the things that I love that you just mentioned is I think it's very easy to look at a finished, polished product of something, of a business model, of the way you tell your story, all of those sort of things. What did that journey look like for you in terms of figuring out what is the right way to tell the story behind Farmer's Pick and your products?
Yeah, I think this is also where modern technology and social media platforms came in. Like one of the first videos that ever went viral. I hadn't slept for like 24 hours. I was packing boxes in our first warehouse, and we got this shipment in of, it was about 1,200 cauliflowers, which if you've ever seen 1,200 cauliflowers, it's a lot of cauliflowers. I literally did a selfie video and was like, hey, like we've just been down to Werribee, just picked up these cauliflowers. There's 1,200. They were knocked back by one of the major supermarkets. Like, just look at this. And it was literally me picking up a cauliflower and just being like, look at this. Does it look that bad? And every single comment was like, I can't tell what's wrong with it. And that kind of pointed to another part of the problem is the aesthetics and the rules have not been have been just generated over so much time that everyone's forgotten why they were created almost in the first place. And then I think that really highlighted the power of social media to spread the story, because people started tagging their friends, they started sending it, and it racked up millions of views like really, really quickly. which blew us away. And I think it's just this. It's a logical once it's pointed to, but until I think we pointed to it, it's quickly or easily not thought about.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like social media is such a great way of just seeing what people will respond to and being able to sort of test and iterate around those sort of things. How much of that was, I guess, designed and planned and I guess what I'm trying to gauge is like how much were you guys just throwing things up against the wall to see what would stick in terms of content that you were sort of putting out there?
Yeah, I think content has evolved rapidly in the last 5 years. Like if you look at Instagram 5 years ago, there was it's this really polished like schmick product. There's companies have spent 30 grand creating some beautiful video that's really aesthetic and yada yada. Fast forward and it's just people doing selfie videos. Like there's this level of authenticity that I think has come into social media that just gives everyone potentially a platform to talk about their niche, their interest, and it seems like every niche has found its audience seemingly today. So I think that was an important piece for us, is that we were able to tell our story authentically, share the perspective of the farmer, and I think also give a perspective behind the curtain that most people aren't privy to. Like unless you're in the industry, there's no time or point that you'll ever come into contact with an imperfect piece of produce, because not many people ever go to a farm because they're seemingly hidden and in the middle of nowhere usually. So I think being able to really lift the curtain on the realities of the industry and some of the decisions that are made in it has coupled with the power of the platform has been massive.
Yeah. Was that I imagine, again, in hindsight, like a very obvious stance to kind of take of just being against the sort of bigger supermarkets in particular and kind of like pointing out some of the issues. But again, I think part of the challenge for startups sometimes is like, oh, you don't want to be too aggressive or like kind of put people offside with things. But I think the real things that kind of cut through the noise are things where you take a very strong stance where people can sit on either side of the fence with those sort of things. But again, was that something that was very obvious for you guys and very deliberate, or was that, again, something that you stumbled on?
I think we stumbled on it a little bit, but I think it always came from the perspective of us believing that it didn't make sense and it was a problem. Who it pointed to in the wrong is not something that we ever have taken a stance on. I think from my perspective, it's all of our responsibility to take charge and ownership of our own food system. Everyone has a responsibility when they're shopping. Everyone has a responsibility to not throw food out in their fridge or to eat your leftovers instead of going and buying a banh mi. Like everyone has micro moments in every single day where they can do something for food waste. So to point at one particular player in the food system would be naive, because I think it's ultimately a combined effort.
Yeah. And, I think one of the things that often gets overlooked in businesses like yours is just the complexity that is required on the operational side of things. So the logistics, the having every time you bring a customer on, you would need to have another 10 or 15 kilograms of products sort of ready to go. What does that look like from a starting point? So what was the early days of Farmer's Pick like? Because I understand you guys were sort of doing this yourself as a side hustle for a while. And then what does that look like now? Yeah,
so the first week I called friends and family and were like, hey, you have to buy a box. I literally sent them the link and was like, you have to pay us money. and they all did. So we had 12 boxes in the first week. My grandma actually found the website without me telling her about it and was the first customer, and she's still a customer, which is really cool. But yeah, it was literally us going out to the market, buying directly from farmers and literally buying 100 kilos of produce and being like, cool, we've got our first orders. We had this red van that was like 30 years old. We still got it actually, which is good. It's cool. Yeah. So there's this, I guess with every customer and every order, there is a physical component to it. There's cost of goods, there's serviceability, and having to deliver it as well. So early days, there was definitely, I think we probably underestimated like the sheer volume of how much food there is in our food system and how much, how many apples just fly around the place. So yeah, early days it was, just us driving a van. That slowly graduated to a bigger van, to a truck, to a big truck, and then to multiple trucks. But yeah, I think as we've grown, having to balance our own operational capacity, like, you need so much time, you need staff, you need hands to pack, and all of these things. Whereas I think if you look on the website and the tech front of things. Like, we can process thousands of orders every day, but the reality is of being able to fulfill them, if that doesn't meet expectations, something's got to give. And I think in the early days when we were scaling without really knowing where it was going to go, we definitely got caught out a few times, which just led to, how do you muscle this problem a few people?
Yeah. I mean, I remember speaking to Simon Griffiths from Who Gives a Crap about the same issue, especially during lockdown, which was insane for them. And they had this crazy wait list. How did you sort of think about, or how do you manage that process? Because I believe there's a story where you guys had sort of 100 orders a week, and then you got featured on Channel 7 News, and you suddenly had 700 subscribers. What does that look like in terms of going, you know, as you mentioned, from a tech perspective, going from 100 to 700 users, great, very easy to fulfill. For your business, much more challenging to do that. So how do you approach something like that?
Yeah, so the website really just says more, please. But when we went from, so very early days, we went from 100 to about 700 orders week on week from a big feature. We were kind of hoping for it, but we didn't really know what it meant. And yeah, I think like the way that we solved that, I think I quit my job the next morning. That was the first step. Then hired 6 people part-time to come and pack. And then we, packed a month's worth of orders in one day, which just led to, at the time it was like, me and my co-founder Josh, we just did 20-hour days. The only challenge is the next week with a subscription, when it rolls over, you've got another 700 orders. So I think in terms of trying to predict that was really hard to predict. I think we've gotten a lot better at that. But 700% growth in a physical goods business is very hard to deal with regardless of your scale. So I think, we've probably just got better at forecasting and trying to stay ahead of it. But also I think hiring the right people into the right positions as we've grown and been able to afford it, which has been good. So, key people in operations and in sort of key roles throughout the business to really manage specific elements and think specifically about that. Because I think there's a trap when scaling a business to think that you know the answer or you are going to come up with the best answer. I think people getting the right people in who have either done it before, done something similar, or just have a good mentality and mindset, they're the people that can really accelerate the business.
We're going to take a very quick break from this podcast to talk about one of our partners, Vanta. So if you're building a SaaS business and want to quickly unlock growth and build customer trust, one way to do this is by achieving compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, CPS 234, Essential 8, or other in-demand compliance frameworks. However, this process is often time-intensive and very costly. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance, making you audit-ready quickly and saving you up to 85% of associated costs. And not only that, Vanta scales with your business. With a market-leading trust management platform to help you continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. You can join over 8,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, and Indebted that use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. As a listener of the show, you can get up to $1,000 US off Vanta when you head over to vanta.com/demo. All right, let's get back to the episode. And you kind of mentioned you've gotten better at forecasting, but I imagine there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. So I imagine you would have to have more farms and farmers and just produce to be able to do that. You need to have more team members that can kind of come on and fulfill those orders. There's just more and more parts of that. How when you say you kind of like have gotten better at forecasting, what does that look like from an operational perspective for the business of just being ahead of the curve with things? Like, do you hire ahead of your needs with stuff, or do you have like agreements in place, or like what does that actually look like?
Yeah, so I think is a really core mentality that myself and Josh take is, we're growing over 100% per annum, and that's our aim for the coming years. Like, food waste is a key part of climate change. Climate change is urgent, and we need to all do something like ASAP. So we're constantly thinking a few years ahead, like we're hiring a few years ahead and trying to work out how to afford it to really maintain the growth and also enable the growth. So I guess from a marketing perspective, it's how we're not only acquiring more customers, but actually starting to think, what more can we do with our existing customers? Is there other product lines that they're interested in and need? Is there a way that we can shift other parts of the food system? So like we started with fruit and veg. We've now gone into sort of manufactured and dry goods, where you've got similar wastage problems because of equally illogical rules that have been put in, like short dated stuff and like misprinted packaging, crazy things like that. But yeah, I think as a core tenet, it's like thinking, who do we need? What skill set do we need in the business in 3 years, and bringing them on to then make 3 years, hopefully half of that, maybe like a year or two.
Yeah.
So just trying to accelerate. Yeah.
Do you have an example of like a role or the composition of a team when you kind of talk about sort of forward projecting 3 years and having that now? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think our marketing team is probably a good example. We hired a head of marketing about a year and a half ago, and we're like, hey, to like take this to the next level, we need more. Their team's now, our marketing team's now 5 people a year and a half later, and we're looking forward. We just hired one more role, and then we've got another role in market in the new year. And I guess just thinking about like where is the value creation and where are our customers coming from? Like this is ultimately, like it's kind of our sales team as well. You know, we're always, and I think there is a trap here around always focusing on acquisition and finding the new customer. And there's like something new and shiny and, you know, about this new customer, but not losing sight or starting to transition our thinking about our customer base to like, how do we actually create more value for our existing customers? How do we get them to absolutely love us? Like they're the ones who are already on the mission. They're bought into, you know, fighting food waste. They want to do more. How do we accelerate them as supporters of the business? So trying to hire people who are going to be in a position to really accelerate that at mass and at scale.
Was there a tipping point for you guys? Because I love that point about kind of focusing on your existing customers. Usually, you know, for a lot of companies, and especially when you're getting off the ground, you have to acquire more customers. You need critical mass around those sort of things. But was there a tipping point for you guys where you sort of realized and made that switch of being very conscious about doubling down on your existing customers versus just purely focusing on net new?
Yeah, I guess we're ultimately a subscription business, so which is sort of comparative to a lot of tech businesses. But I think when effectively your LTV to CAC ratio starts to shift another way, and yeah, as that sort of starts to shift, you're like, oh, actually, we've got this huge cohort of avid fans. Like we've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are already behind us. Like surely there's more that they can and want to do with Farmers Pick. So like, how can we just encourage that and foster it really?
And yeah, I guess there's like the double-edged, not sword of that, but like there's the realization that that's really important and should be critical of the business, and then that's actually executing that and enabling that. So what does that actually look like? So when you talk about doing more with your existing customers, what does that look like for Farmers Pick?
Yeah, I think on the acquisition front, we got really good at telling the story in social media. Like when it comes to food waste, we're like, oh, this is the story. This is how we tell it. We're starting to integrate, you know, more farms and farmers into the storyline. And then, you know, you start to optimize all of your conversion activity around, you know, email marketing and SMS. Lifetime, I think, is a really different beast though. How do you think about, there's so many ways to skin a cat in terms of how to think about lifetime and lifetime value. But yeah, I guess like where we're going is like, how do we create like bona fide waste warriors, like people who have been with us for years, and how do we elevate them as the true champions alongside our farmers? Because like I look at our customers and I look at our suppliers, and they're actually the people fixing the problem. We're just sitting in the middle. We're part of the bit in the middle. We're the conduit perhaps, but you know, I want people thinking about them being waste warriors, them being part of the solution and having that tangible impact. I think, you know, you get your delivery every week. You've got 10 kilos of product that was surplus and would have otherwise gone to waste. And, you know, there's that moment every week that I want to create with every Australian where they're like, I'm part of the solution. And then I think obviously back to our farmers, they're the ones, you know, breaking their backs, sweating and bleeding to ultimately feed our country. So, you know, they're the real heroes.
Yeah. Speaking of your social media, I think after I went on your website, I started getting targeted with ads on Facebook. I was seeing you got like 299 comments or something and a bunch of likes and things like that on the post. When you say you've really nailed or have a better understanding of like what's really resonating on social media, for the benefit of founders that are listening to this that are maybe just starting to dabble in this space. What are, like, do you have any recommendations in terms of how they should think about that or how they should approach this?
Yeah, I mean, it changes. There's so many different businesses out there starting, but I think it's something that people can resonate to and can see as a problem. Like, I think for us, it was just pointing to something that didn't make sense, and then people make up their own minds, usually with that information. I think probably one of the detrimental things that we've probably seen with social media in the past years is, the leverage on negative emotions around, provoking fear and creating anxiety, which is, it's got so many negative outcomes, and that's not really what we ever want to do. But yeah, I think for us, it's really just pointing to something that didn't make sense and letting people make up their own minds, usually based on the facts, hopefully.
Just wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, which is, trying to hire 3 years ahead of where you're at, and then trying to figure out how you're going to actually pay for all of those things. From what I understand, you guys haven't raised a sort of formal traditional VC round of funding. You've done 2 crowdsourced funding rounds. Do you want to talk a little bit about your sort of fundraising journey and why you sort of decided to go down the crowdfunding route versus thinking about other sources of capital?
Yeah, so I guess our decision making was along the lines of, like, we needed some money for some of the capital items that we needed, like trucks, warehouse, fundamentally fixed costs of a food business or a food services business, and a few key heads to run, operations, marketing primarily. We explored like sort of every option out there, I guess. At the time, I think it was 2022, I should know that, where we did our first raise, and we had explored VCs early, and I think at the time Milk Run had been and gone. I think they raised like over 100 mil, and I think we got a lot of feedback of like, no, I just invested in Milk Run and I've been burnt by it, or I've just seen people invest in Milk Run and they've been burnt by it, so I'm going to try and learn from their mistake. And I think that probably poisoned the well a little bit for us in the VC space. I guess as a really early stage business, we were also thinking, how can we maintain control of the business as well, like from a founder perspective. Like, we've got a pretty gnarly vision around fighting food waste, and we don't want to be distracted by that. So, whilst there would be the right fit, I think, in the VC space with some of them at the time, we didn't really sort of find that. So anyway, one of them actually pointed us towards crowdfunding as an interesting option for us, and we sort of scratched that, and we looked at people who had raised there before, and I think there's a few components that really worked well for us. It's like, first of all, it's a consumer goods business where, people can try before they buy it. They could literally order a Farmer's Pick box before they invested in Farmer's Pick. I think we had a strong audience already in terms of our previous customers, existing and active customers, and the ability to communicate. I think why we needed the money was very clear. It was like, hey, we need the money to accelerate our mission and vision, which you're already seeing, you're experiencing. So I think the connection between what we needed and why we needed it was super clear. And then I think, just the audience, like, you've got customers who are like, hey, I just want to put in $250 and, continue to buy your box, and we just like what you do. So that was, it definitely got us to where we needed to at the time.
Yeah. And, I think the Milk Run example is really interesting to kind of draw on, where unfortunately sometimes particular industries, verticals, technology gets really hot, and there's a lot of investor appetite in investing in particular spaces. Sometimes it goes the other way, which, as you kind of mentioned, there are, really big reasons why investors sort of pull back from particular sectors or markets because, as you said, they've been burnt by a particular situation or they haven't seen something quite work. What was that period like for you in terms of, clearly you sort of needed capital at that time to accelerate what it is that you were doing, in terms of trying to sort of navigate that sort of fundraising process for you overall? Yeah,
so I think something that we've always done as a pretty core tenet of our business is be quite frugal, be quite intent about, looking at, like, constantly reviewing all of our contracts. Like, it's a relatively high fixed cost business relative to some. So making sure that we're getting good deals on, what we're buying, what we're signing at all times. I think in terms of navigating the raise at the time, we were just, trying to really batten down the hatches and be an effective business, really reduce our cash burn, which had moments that was pretty bad. But yeah, I think we were able to wrestle it back in a lot of cases by just reviewing everything and being like, hey, like this is our cash burns at about 3 months. If we can address a few things, like can we get it to 6 months? And we're sort of able to do that at one particular time before, like as we were raising. So yeah, so I think like just that frugality really helped us at the time.
Any advice on the negotiation piece as well? Because I know that that's something that like I've seen some of our portfolio companies, Playbook Ventures, do that really successfully. I know that that's like helped me previously with previous businesses as well. But from your perspective, any advice on how you sort of structure either contracts or just even how you sort of approach negotiations like that to get the outcome that you want?
Yeah, I think for us, it's always been about trying to find a win-win, even if we go back to our suppliers and our product and our fundamental proposition. It's like we actually need everyone here to have a positive outcome, and there's no reason that they can't. So I think, when there's been tight moments, we've lent on strong relationships with certain suppliers and been like, hey, like, we're in a bit of a pinch, help me help you. Like, I think we can get through it. Yeah, there was some that we were sort of important to their business, they were important to our business. And I think generally, like, with good relationships and with potential, I think there's an opportunity to sort of band together with close and important partners and work it out sort of together.
Yeah, I think what you said just kind of nails it on the head, which is, I think it's very difficult to have long-term relationships with people if people feel burnt through those negotiation situations. And so, like you said, in terms of framing things in a win-win environment where genuinely it is beneficial for both of you in the short or long term, just helps ease a lot of those conversations to get to a more positive outcome. Versus, again, it's very hard to work with someone long term if they feel like, or you feel like you're being taken advantage of, or you're getting kind of burnt through the deal. Yeah,
I think it is pretty hard to persist at a partnership where you feel like you lose every time. Got to have a few wins in there, I think, on both sides though.
Yeah. And I think something that kind of comes across very powerfully is the core mission of what it is that you're doing at Farmers Pick. And I think it's really interesting in terms of how that sort of looks from the early team that you sort of bring together. So the people that are kind of there and remember the story about the red truck and all of those sort of things and were part of that journey. Now you've got, I believe, 120 people or so.
Yep.
Split across two cities. And I think you mentioned through a previous chat that, you've got people up in Brisbane that you've just never even met with before. How do you, for such a powerful story and message and mission that you guys are on, how do you sort of translate that as you grow from a team of 5 or 6 people to 100 plus?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting challenge. And I think it's something that anyone who's senior in our business is actually facing it at like multiple levels. But I think as you're growing, that story gets diluted. I can sit here and I can tell you the story in depth and you can get every detail and every piece of emotion and it comes through really clearly. Whereas, you start to talk to 10 people, to 50 people, to 100 people, or then across multiple sites, like, there's people that luckily we're going up next week for the Christmas party, which will be good, but it'll be great to meet a whole bunch of people who have been working at Farmers Pick now for months without really getting any touch or have any tangibility with the story or any real resonation with our core mission. So yeah, I think in terms of like reinventing our story and also our methods of communications is something we're working through at the moment, which is like, how do we actually tell this story en masse to a sort of broader audience and really get everyone along for the ride? Because, there's so much value in, I think, going to work every day with an underlying purpose, liking your job, liking your managers, liking the people that you work with is really important, and it can really bring a lot to a job. But if it's underpinned also by a strong mission that you feel attached to, I think there's a lot of value there, and we want people who are passionate about what we do.
Yeah. And part of that is that sort of repetition piece. So like if you're in the office and you don't even need to have that conversation, but if you hear those conversations happening throughout the day, they're just kind of happening in the background, you do absorb them. But I guess it is harder when people aren't in the central place where the founders are, or they just don't have that sort of same connection piece to feel as connected.
Yeah it's just the communication through larger audiences, it just starts to change. And it's like I think through the creation of values and being clear on like objectives where we're going, but also what we've achieved, and then back to repetition, I think it's a really good point. It's like, well, there's new staff every week or every few weeks. There's at least a few new staff. So how do we continue to sort of perpetuate that through the business and communicate it clearly?
And I think one of the really powerful things, as you kind of mentioned through social media, is bringing your customers along on that journey as well. And again, seeing some of the comments on the posts that you guys have, you can really kind of sense the connection that your customers have to your product and the vision and purpose behind and the mission behind Farmers Pick. Again, part of that is just natural. I think there's a very natural story around helping farmers, produce, waste, all of those sort of things. But is there anything that you do in particular to help build and foster that community that kind of underpins and brings people together?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like micro moments that we've tried to create in the product that we're trying to kind of exacerbate and make more clear now. But one example would be like when you get your box, if you look at the top lid, it just says, "Good on you, you've saved this." You've contributed to fighting food waste. And every time you get a delivery, you see that. Whenever we communicate to people, something that we try and do, from time to time is tell them, hey, you've had 23 orders, that equates to over 200 kilos of produce saved. Like you're doing something, you're a part of this journey, you're an important person, you're important in this journey. And I think it's putting the power back in the customer's hands. Like this has to happen at a really like grassroots level. And I think it's an interesting one that I sort of see sometimes come through on social posts is where, like good customers, loyal customers will jump in and kind of bat down any negative comments. So I think, creating the community and just creating that sense of purpose around our customers is, it's been really cool.
Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia catering to all stages of your business life. If you're busy running a business, you don't always have the time to do your own books and forecasts, and instead you can fully outsource your finance function so that you have the time and resources back to do what you do best, which is growing your business. They have a dedicated focus on founders, funds, and startups, and have an experienced team that can help you with everything from managing your tax to balancing your books to even helping with your exit strategy. I trust and use them with all of my businesses and can't recommend them highly enough. To find out more or to speak to Gareth and the team, head over to sender.com. All right, let's get back to this episode. And I imagine that one of the things you kind of touched on a little bit earlier is just the additional costs that are involved in running a business like yours compared to running a tech business. Again, it's not easy, as you kind of mentioned earlier, in terms of the tech debt that's involved in building a platform is still quite costly. And if you want to make changes, there's a whole process that you need to go through. But I think especially for a business like yours, you can't just go, all right, great, we're going to turn on Sweden, or go global from day one. What does that look like in terms of making those trade-off decisions for you as a business when you are looking to expand or looking to devote resources to particular things? How do you make those decisions internally?
Yeah, I got a question if we're going to expand to Indonesia soon. And I was like, no, I don't think so. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of challenges around the agility. Like we can have the agility, I think, in terms of how we operate and how we innovate in our product, and I think in our story and how we connect with our customers. But there is people are like, oh, why don't you just put this in the box? And you're like, yeah, doing that at scale is really challenging. And I think the ability to pivot, I think pivot's a dirty word sometimes, but I think the ability to make those kind of rapid changes isn't always there. So I think it always comes down to having the mission, the vision at the forefront, and say, how are we going to get there, and creating a plan that has to be 6 to 12 months, and gradually moving towards it, because changing everything and flipping it on its head overnight with so much momentum and so many like embedded physical processes and things that actually have to happen, like, trucks and people and forklifts and warehousing and all that sort of stuff is just it's like a weird kind of tech debt in its own sense. It's like a physical debt.
And you kind of touch on your objective is to grow 100% year on year, yet you kind of you've mentioned this several times, like there's a real sort of value, like company value on frugality, and being very conscious of how you sort of do that. Again, how do you sort of balance the two of remaining high growth, being very innovative with what you do, while still being very conscious of spend? So, not to now on this, but like using Milk Run as an example of like there's a very specific strategy of being able to kind of focus purely on growth. It seems like you've got similar ambitions in terms of growth, but have a very different approach to how you sort of think about doing that.
Yeah, so I think innovation will always come from sort of within, and I don't think it has to necessarily be expensive, I guess. So yeah, always, I think from a personnel perspective, everyone in my team has like the full mantra to be innovative, think creatively, think outside the box, and challenge, what we do today and how we do it. And then I think also combining on, what is the most effective way to achieve our mission and our vision. And yeah, so what's the most effective way? Like, should we be, and it comes back to earlier where we were talking about the sort of, was there a switch from acquisition to retention, or was there a change in how we started to think about customers? And I think when we look at it, we're like, oh, well, what's the thing that we can do to accelerate our mission the most? And it's like, well, we also need to do both, but trying to change swing the pendulum, I guess, a little bit towards our customers, and surprising and delighting them and creating incremental value for them. And I guess from how to do this on a frugal, be relatively frugal along the way, I think is just like from a core process and operational perspective, where are the sort of the leverage points that we have in our delivery network. And like, we made a very intentional decision, for example, not to build our own delivery network, but to focus on our knitting and outsource the sort of like the last mile, because we're like, well, these vans, or the vans that are already out there, are going to be out there regardless. Do we need to put more vans out there? Is that the best thing? Not only for our ability to deliver on it at cost, or at a decent, respectable cost, but also like, do we want another 50 or 100 vans driving around every day? Or can we just piggyback on the existing infrastructure?
So you mentioned having a very innovative culture and trying to enable that through the entire business. Again, that's something, if you ask every company wants to do that and wants to create that kind of company culture. What are particular things that you try and do to help empower everyone in your team to think and act that way?
Like, if I sort of think about our marketing team, like there's a set hour, 2 hours every single week where we sit down with a whiteboard and we just throw silly ideas out there. I think there's also I think this sort of actually comes from like the genesis of the product and the root cause of the problem. Like, when we looked at the issue, being like one of our first questions was like, how do we flip this on its head? How do we flip this negative idea of it being a waste product and having so many negative connotations? How do we flip that to being a positive? Yeah, and I think there's that kind of embedded like inverse thinking. How do we do something completely different? Like, one of the team in the marketing team the other day asked, like, what are the silly ideas you think will fail but we should think about doing anyway?
Love that.
Yeah, and it's like, maybe they're all terrible, but you only need one. So
that's awesome. And I know that this kind of is something that I've spoken to a lot of other founders about on this podcast, about when they sort of start in the early days, they're kind of involved in so many different parts of their business, but as they kind of continue to grow, especially as they go sort of 50, 100 people or so, their role continues to evolve and change quite significantly day to day. How has your role changed from, I guess, doing the picking and the packing for $700 a week to what does it look like now with the team that you've got set up?
Yeah, it's been a constant evolution, and I think it's been probably the most enjoyable part almost of running the business, alongside probably the positive outcomes that we're creating for farmers and for our customers, is just the personal challenge of reinvention, I think, every 9 to 12 months, and actually staying relevant and continuing to create value in your own company. I think I've always come from a tech first perspective of like where tech can take the job, like let the robots do it, was something that one of my managers at, I think, Brahma's Pay said. He was like, if let the robots do it. Yeah. It's like, if you can let the robots do it, let the robots do it. So that's always sort of been a foundation of like, if it can be automated, automate it, do the creative stuff. The robots can't do that yet, although they're getting better. Yeah. So I think that constant reinvention, like from going from packing boxes to driving forklifts to driving trucks to being marketing to having a marketing team, that constant reinvention of like creating value, like whilst trying to make yourself redundant. So my objective's always been like, how do I make myself redundant in this role? Like, how do I put someone or something in place that is going to do it as well, if not better than I can do it? And this fundamental belief that I can't do it better than everyone. Like, I think there's a trap. Sometimes I think there's a value where a founder can step in and, kind of go founder mode, a buzzword, sorry, and really like take an issue, muscle a problem, rally everyone around it. I think there is a power that a founder has to be able to accelerate certain areas or, projects or product releases or something like that and make sure it happens just because of the shortcuts they know in the business, i.e. like how to get money or how to get the person who knows the specific piece of knowledge that needs to be done, or if there's just a skeleton in the closet that they know about and no one else knows about. So I think there's definitely a role for that, but I think at a steady growth, from a steady growth perspective, how to make yourself redundant but also continue to create and innovate and create value within the business.
I think it's something Adrian Osman from Mr. Yum and I mean you mentioned, and a few other people have mentioned as well, is kind of they felt like their role was to start something new, so kind of take the lead with a particular area, and then eventually when it got to a good enough point, find someone that can kind of come in and take that to the next level and kind of step away and then find the next thing as well. And I think there's this continuous learning process that you have to go through. How do you approach that learning for yourself? Because I imagine that there's a lot that you've had to kind of take on as part of that journey over the last 4 years. Yeah,
I think for me, it's always been about, like, whenever I feel kind of lost or unsure if I'm taking the right next step, I think coming back to the original reason why we started Farmer's Pick is usually the most valuable thing to me. So it's, be it like we launched a new website 3 or 4 months ago and everyone was getting a bit sick of the process. It was a bit delayed. And then coming back to like, what's the most important thing that we can do in the next 3 months to accelerate, fighting food waste and accelerate Farmer's Pick ability to be a part of that change. And it was like, well, our website's the most important thing in the next 3 months. So I think that really helped, just going deep into it where required and rallying the team and helping that, just trying to bring everyone together, be like, hey, this is the reason it's the most important as well. But that constant reinvention, I think there's a combination of inspiration from other founders or other stories of scale and business growth and change, and I think inspiration can come from a lot of different places though. Yeah,
I really love your point about sometimes just simplifying a lot of this to like, what's the core reason why we're doing that. So your example earlier of should you have look after your own delivery process, it's actually kind of counter to your mission of what you're trying to do, and probably maybe is as a separate thing maybe isn't the right thing for the business anyway. But having that kind of very clear reason why you're doing something just makes a lot of those decisions, which seem very difficult to make, sometimes a lot simpler.
Yeah, and I think there's things that we've tried to do that we thought would make sense in theory that we've then decided to cut because they didn't. I think a good example was wholesale supply. So we get a lot of inquiries about, hey, can you deliver fruit and veg to my cafe or to my restaurant or or like food services or catering or something like that. And we're like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And we're like, we already have the product coming in. We have suppliers who can supply it. And then we went to do it. And we're like, okay, the ordering system is completely different. The pick and pack is completely different. The delivery is completely different. The only thing that is the same thing is like, yes, the tomato is the same, but the way that it gets from woe to go is completely different. And when you look at the product being the tomato, you're like, oh yeah, it's obvious it's the same product. But I think as a service, there's a lot of differentiation there. And then we're going back down to, okay, now we have to run our own fleet of vans. It's like, well, let's look at the structure of our business, and it's like we're not geared up to be able to do that or to utilize them in an effective way. A lot of delivery networks are built up over usually a very long time, and there's a reason for that, and that's because they're very capital intensive, and efficiency and effectiveness of utilization of the asset is really important to it actually being feasible.
I think it's so easy to get caught up in the weeds and caught up in the day-to-day of it. So especially when feels like a very big strategic decision that you're making for the company, you can get very laser focused on that. It sounds like you or the company is really good at being able to take a step back and kind of really find the North Star with things. Again, is that like a very conscious thing that you do? Is that something that you try and like how do you sort of go about doing that and making sure that that's the guiding light with how you make decisions?
Yeah, so I think I'm fortunate in this regard where I have a co-founder who comes from, we're very aligned, but we come at it from a very different perspective in being logistics and operations, whereas I've sort of come from a sales, marketing, customer background, and he's probably a credit for the frugality, really. But we catch up every week and we just try and change. We try and change the context as well, so we don't catch up at work. We'll go and get a coffee for an hour. And there's some key things that we'll run through that are very BAU, but there's always a part of that conversation which is like, kind of, I think the question is really along the lines of, are we doing the right things today for the next 12 months? And I think coming back to that as like a kind of core tenet is, it keeps us equally balanced in the importance of the day-to-day operations and doing that really, really well, not only for our customers, but also for our farmers and, at every point of the supply chain, but also like, are we keeping an eye on sort of what's coming, coming ahead?
Yeah. Love that. In terms of coming ahead, what's next for Farmers Pick?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I think there's a really interesting time at the moment in our food system. There's been decades where it's been optimized for some players, but not every player. Our food system affects every single person in Australia, and it should serve the people that it was created for. So I think there's some interesting moves and changes going on at the moment that are going to, I hope, put the power back in the hands of, the people and consumers, and give them clarity and transparency around, why things cost more or less, but also, continue to create good outcomes for the farmers who, if we look at the hierarchy of needs, food's at the very base level, and they're responsible for that ultimately. So without them, we're in a bit of strife. So I think that's just continuing to, tell the story of food waste and continuing to push it and challenge why it should happen at all is really, more of that.
Love that. Well, thank you for taking the time to come on the show and for sharing your story and Farmers Pick story. For those people that want to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
It's just Google Farmers Pick. Our website will come up and you'll be able to see us, or I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, perfect. I will make sure both of those links are in the show notes. Josh, once again, absolutely love what you're doing, and thanks so much for coming on the show and for sharing your experience and insights. Thanks so much for having us.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 202 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As always, full show notes from this episode will be available at startupplaybook.co. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.